I'd like to share with you some less intuitive reasons for rejection in job interviews, and this is primarily based on me listening to recorded interviews of my clients. Probably the most common reason for rejection in job interviews today, and the reason that not many candidates are fully aware of, is bluffing in job interviews. You know, you come up with a little metric you didn't fully own, or a decision and these sort of things. And many candidates assume bluffing is for low-performing candidates. In my experience, this is not at all the case. It happens all the time for director level roles, or even I recently had a senior PM in fintech. People who can interview exceptionally well, but yet still, they feel tempted to make things up to show as, the best possible candidate for the purpose of a job interview. The next thing I like to talk about here would be the hands-on versus hands-off trap. And this is representative in all major FANGs, but with any high-performing company. In its most basic form, they would simply ask you, are you a hands-on or a hands-off professional? And many candidates would assume, hey, you know what, I should, if I'm a hands-on candidate, I would say I'm 90% hands-on and only 10% hands-off. Whereas if they're looking for someone who's a bit more balanced, the job interview, that could easily signal it's game over for you in that interview, even without you realizing, right? And basically what I'm pitching to you here, to understand the right balance for the role that you're applying for, is the hands-on or hands-off. Try to figure this out early on in the process while you still can ask your interviewers, hey, is this a hands-on versus a hands-off role? And if they're asking you the direct question, hey, how hands-on are you in percentage? Try to get something closer to maybe your 60% hands-on versus 40% hands-off. And even if they're looking for someone primarily hands-off, it's still not game over. The next thing I like to talk about here would be when your answers do really sound great, but not for the right type of role or the right type of seniority. Classic scenario is a director asked, how do you handle conflict inside your team? To which you'd come up with an example of a simple conflict, a simple unimportant conflict without much importance for an actual outcome. This would be considered too safe as an answer with an interview with the high-performing companies, especially for roles where conflict resolution can be considered as critical expertise. Right? The next point I'd like to share here would be something which I never expected to be such an issue in these job interviews. That is to have a behavior that's too aggressive. Okay, what do I mean by this? Well, some candidates can have a tendency to interrupt their interviewers. And I know that it may sound odd to you, hey Dan, wow, so why is this such a big problem if I interrupt my interview? Because I know what they're going to say, so I'm going to give my best answer. Well, in reality, if you put yourself in your interviewer's shoes and you'd be interviewing people all day long, you'd realize that it won't come across as you think it would if you interrupt your interviewer. It could be for many reasons, but all in all, it will not be perceived well. Also, in my experience, it's rarely to your advantage that you interrupt your interviewers. Another reason you may be perceived as too aggressive, when you get asked the following interview question: what are your hobbies? What do you do outside work? Some candidates think that they must show as high performers outside work. You say you run a 10K every other day and these sort of things. When in fact, most interviewers are expecting normality, are expecting a balanced candidate, a work-life balance that makes sense. So they're not expecting exceptionalism. So this is how you may come across as a bit aggressive. This would be the two extremes, the two different scenarios that are the most common. And the last thing I want to talk about here is something, again, which may come as a surprise to many candidates, is giving superficial answers in job interviews is not always what you think it is. Some candidates prepare specifically for these job interviews to be able to answer any interview question they get asked. They simply interpret these interviews as a trivia game. And what happens is, if you take these interviews like so, then due to the fact that interview questions are quite predictable these days, you will have a certain degree of success. You might even answer every single question as you prepared it to answer for that job interview, that is as quickly as possible. And when you answer interview questions as a trivia game, it's, in my experience, very often the case that you give superficial answers simply because you prepared superficially to answer those questions, right? So is preparing to be able to answer any interview question versus preparing to give the best possible answer to the interview questions you're asked. Right? So in my experience, I have a lot better success with people who prepared to give their best answers to the interview questions, even if they got stuck, by the way, during job interviews because they didn't know how to answer some specific question, versus candidates who prepared their interviews like a trivia game to be able to answer any possible question they would throw at them. This would be the most interesting scenario I'd like to share. I wanted to share with you. I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.